Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for, what is this? The sixth in a 15-part series? The seventh in a 15-part series? Let's see. We're here for Boarding House from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the seventh in a 15-part series as we journey short story by short story through Dubliners by James Joyce. So this will be in two separate playlists here on the channel. Number one, obviously, being the short story discussion playlist, where I've got a myriad of short stories that we have discussed so far on this channel, but also the Dubliners playlist, which obviously going short story by short story through Dubliners. So be sure to check that out as well. What we have here is a So What Happened portion of this video where we will discuss sort of what happened. Surprise. In the short story. But then we will get into a little bit of literary criticism and finally Writer's Corner, where we take away maybe some pointers from the great James Joyce for our writing. So what happened? We start with Mr. and Mrs. Mooney, who are in a bad marriage. And when the abuse reaches the point that Mr. Mooney chases Mrs. Mooney with a cleaver, she leaves and takes the kids. She finds herself running a boarding house, and when Mr. Mooney does not stop trying to see their daughter Polly while she is at work, Mrs. Mooney decides to employ Polly at the house. Polly, being a fetching young woman, has no trouble garnering attention for herself from the men who pass through. But Mrs. Mooney is no fool, and she handles most of that attention in curt fashion. Until Polly starts to receive attention from Mr. Doran. Mrs. Mooney lets this attention go on until it is common knowledge that it is no longer attention, but an affair, at which time she will tell him that she expects him to marry Polly. The day comes and Mr. Doran is in his room as they are Mr. Doran is in his room as he is summoned, and Polly is in the room with him, and they are both nervous wrecks. Mr. Doran goes down to the meeting, and Polly is suddenly nervous no longer. She is no longer crying, and she sits at the foot of the bed, which had served as their bed, and she waits, quote, patiently, almost cheerfully, until she is called to the hall, as Mr. Doran has apparently agreed to take her hand in marriage. So, literary criticism. What is the point of this short story? Why are we reading this short story? What is going on here? What is the actual meat? Well, life is hard. Life is a very hard and confusing thing that sometimes we back into. We back into the right decision from time to time. But where I want to start this conversation is here. As Mr. Doran and Polly are in the room waiting, she is crying and saying that she will end her own life. He is sort of distraught. He is flipping back and forth between, I really do kind of love the girl, and boy, I don't know if I can marry this woman. I really do kind of love her, but she's kind of rough around the edges, isn't she? I don't have a whole lot of prospects, but the prospects that I at one time had were better than this. And it leads us to this here. She was a little vulgar sometimes. Sometimes she said, I seen, and if I had have known. But what would grammar matter if he really loved her? Here's the thing. He's making these observations. This is the great cause of consternation in this short story. He is making these observations because he is from a higher class. He has had that education. Polly has not. We get little snippets of Jack being Mr. and Mrs. Mooney's son, and he's kind of a tough character. Well, if you were from the correct class, you didn't have to be a tough character. So part of the consternation here is the fact that Mr. Doran is Mr. Doran. He's not Jack, right? He is of a higher class. He's still in the boarding house, right? He's still made some mistakes in his life. He's still off the beaten path. He's still in his mid-30s without a wife. But this short story is all of these characters coming to terms with how messy real life is. Mr. and Mrs. Mooney are in a marriage that is not going well, but she does not leave him until he takes to chasing her with a cleaver. That's how bad things had to get for her to leave. At that point, Mr. Mooney is obviously not a great guy, but he does still want something to do with his daughter. That's why he goes to try to see her when she's at work. He's still a piece of garbage, but he does seem to want some relationship with his daughter. Mrs. Mooney then gets this job, which seems to be a station in life. She has, in this house, some type of authority. They respect her. They call her madam. Now, the madam of a house is often associated with prostitution. So it's not strictly speaking a term of endearment. It is not strictly speaking a term of respect. But they do call her madam. Polly is a difficult character, is she not? Polly is someone who is eliciting attention and flirting. It's easy to see why, right? She's getting attention from the people. She's getting attention from the men around her. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Still, it is unbecoming if we're talking about polite society. Mr. Doran seems to be in some type of down on his luck. What I'm getting at here is everyone is at odds. They're at odds with themselves. They are at odds with their own stations in life. They are at odds with their families. They are at odds with what it is that might be expected from their characters. Now, because of these jagged pieces of a puzzle fit together if you just cram them in there hard enough. We have, for example, from Mr. Doran, this weighing act. Well, he does love her. She's rough around the edges. She is younger than him, which is seen as desirable. But he does have some of his stuff together. As noted by Mrs. Mooney, he's not a complete farce. He has some of his stuff together. And this is the very mix and match of couple making in this short story. The next question I have here is, how do we feel about Polly? How should we feel about Polly? What exactly is Polly doing in this short story? Well, it seems that she has flirted with plenty of the men that have come through the house, and most of this is preempted by her mother. Is there a spoken or unspoken agreement between her and her mother about Mr. Doran? Mr. Doran. Mr. Duran. Now, it seems that it is unspoken. We have little hints at that in the short story, meaning that in her flirtations with Mr. Doran, she has some type of okay from her mother. Then it escalates from flirtation to an affair. But then, so she has one over her mother, she has one over Mr. Doran, she's won over several of the men apparently that have come through the house and settled on Mr. Doran for the better or for the worse. And when this proposed meeting between Mr. Doran and Mrs. Mooney comes up, obviously both Mr. Doran and Polly, the daughter, know that this is coming because she is in his room and she's just as nervous as is he. She doesn't know what's going on. She's kind of struggling with it herself until he's called out of the room. And then all of her hesitation is gone, and she had feigned the emotions with Mr. Doran until he's out of the room. And then it becomes clear she was faking this all the while because she's at the foot of the bed daydreaming about the future that the two might have together. So she had made up her mind about this. Now, here's maybe a real question for application from this short story, because that's what literature's for, right? Literature's for the application that we can find for it in our lives. How often do we back into things? How often do we back into love in the way that Mr. Doran seems to have done in this short story? He is whiffle-waffling about this decision before he even goes to sit down with Mrs. Mooney. He's whiffle-waffling about trying to understand, I kind of love her, I kind of can't stand her, I want to be around her, but sometimes, man, she sounds real dumb. All of these things are going through his mind, but is there any perfect love? Is there any puppy love that actually goes over? I contend no. And if there is, it's probably because the people who are in puppy love are dumb. That's just my take. That's my opinion. You can make of it what you will. Maybe I'm wrong. But how often in life is it that we back into these positions? And it doesn't have to be with love. It doesn't have to be with a partner. It can be, for example, with a career. How often do you just yes boss your way into something at work that ends up kind of working out, but it wasn't really what you had in mind, but you're getting paid more, but you don't really want to do it? But those paychecks make the bills pretty easy, but it kind of sucks to have to go to work on Monday. But with that money, your time outside of work is pretty easy. All of these things. Well, I wanted a fast car, but when I got to the dealership, everything was too expensive for me, and I sat in the trucks, and the trucks were so tall, and I sat in the SUVs, and the SUVs felt like driving a boat, et cetera, et cetera. All of these little decisions that we have in life that we end up backing ourselves into. Now, that's all for the Lit Crit portion. Let's go to the Writer's Corner portion of this. And for that, I want to take us right back up to this opening paragraph. Mrs. Mooney was a butcher's daughter. She was a woman who was quite able to keep things to herself, a determined woman. She had married her father's foreman and opened a butcher's shop near Spring Gardens. But as soon as his father-in-law was dead, Mr. Mooney began to go to the devil. He drank, plundered the till, ran headlong into debt. It was no use making him take the pledge. He was sure to break out again a few days later. By fighting his wife in the presence of customers and buying bad meat, he ruined his business. One night he went for his wife with a cleaver, and she had to sleep in a neighbor's house. Do you see how at a distance we are there? There's distance between us and this story. We're not smelling the dried blood that was still on the cleaver as he chased her. We're not hearing the neighbors' lights turn on as they come to the door to help her. We're not, what are the other senses we got here? We're not feeling the coarse nature of his shirts as she washes them, but they are doused in alcohol and dried blood from the butcher shop. None of these things. We're all at a distance. And James Joyce is certainly the ilk of writer who could make us right there, face to face with all of these things. We could be there in our senses, but we are not for some reason. We are we're almost in a Jane Austen novel, right? This is sort of, to my experience anyway, the distance from which Jane Austen wrote her sort of fiction. For me, Jane Austen's fiction was never particularly tangible. You couldn't smell it. You couldn't feel it. You couldn't really hear it. They were characters on a page. For me, that's exactly how this short story is. We are never on the body with this short story as it is said. On the body meaning, in this short story, a lot you get, he was nervous. Instead, if you go on the body, Mr. Doran had one arm crossed, and with the other he was tapping his head, right? This is nervous, isn't it? But we show this. We go on the body for this. We don't tell nervous. And the last thing I want to say here, this beginning bit, Miss Mooney was a butcher's daughter, right? All of this, it seems at the beginning very throwaway. It seems at the beginning, at the almost through the end of the short story, it seems sort of superfluous. But it's actually really brilliant. Because what James Joyce has done in the very beginning of this short story about taking a stranger as your husband or wife is that he has set up this horrible dimension by which marrying the wrong person can absolutely flummox you for the rest of your days. He has set up the idea in all of us, in every one of his readers, that Mr. Doran's nervousness here is 100% warranted. Now, in the beginning of the story, obviously, it is the husband that is the wayward one. But we have here at the end, Polly is kind of a disingenuous character, doing what she can to get what she wants. So it would be easy without that beginning part. It would be very easy to read this short story and be absolutely yelling at Mr. Doran, just take the woman as your wife. Take her as your wife. You've already done this. You've had this affair. You seem to like her. Maybe she's kind of dumb. Maybe she's rough around the edges. Maybe she doesn't talk the way you like, or whatever. Maybe she got a little bit of a bad reputation. You're in a boarding house. I'm saying to say it. It would be very easy without that beginning spiel about Mr. and Mrs. Mooney's life for this to be just a knockout, drag-out win for both Polly and Mr. Doran. Her reputation gets to be saved by Mr. Doran. He's apparently got some of his life in order. He gets a wife. She's apparently young and fetching and everything else that, maybe a little rough around the edge. Who cares, right? But because we have that story between Mr. and Mrs. Mooney there, all of a sudden, the entirety of this give and take becomes so much more obvious to the readers, and obvious to the readers in a way that we don't even really process at the time that we're reading the short story. We have to come back and analyze Where did we start this short story? And why did we end where we did? Yeah, I thought that's just a brilliant way to start a short story that ends the way James Joyce is ending this one. That is all I have for this, a discussion about Boarding House by James Joyce. If you enjoy what I do here, hitting the like button really helps me out here on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel. There is poetry every Monday and short stories, novel read-alongs. There's always stuff going on the channel, so be sure to come back. And I hope to have you back for the next one.